Okay, are you ready?
Oh yeah.
Excellent. So, what is the movie about?
Okay, the movie is about a guy called Will who is trying to tell the story of his father through the gauze of what his father told him. So his father is a man supposedly of tall tales and all kinds of other fictitious things. You can't really tell what's real from his stories and what he's just made up. So this guy Will, who feels upset that he doesn't know his dad, when his dad is dying, he finally decides, oh no, I need to know about my dad. He basically gives him a hard time throughout the entire film, and then turns out to be a massive douche for the fact that all of his dad's stories are surprisingly true. And then he decides, oh actually, you know, my dad was a good guy, and I knew that he was, I know in my heart now that he was actually a good person, and didn't tell lies and things like that.
I see. And who are the main characters? Could you describe them?
Yeah, so, well, okay, I'll try and give physical descriptions as well as mental ones, or, you know, psychological ones. So Will is the, well, you can't really call him the protagonist. He's the son of this guy called Edward Bloom. Now, Edward Bloom, I suppose, is really the main character. We see him at various stages in his life, when he's young and when he's old. He is a man who has supposedly lived a really interesting life. He's, when he's young, you know, a fairly handsome chap who's quite charismatic, and then when he's older, he seems a bit more doddery, not quite as, he still maintains that same charisma as when he was younger. He can still command a room with his stories, but he's quite tired in the way that he behaves. His son, on the other hand, is much younger when his dad is old, and I suppose he's a bit of an odd one because he really doesn't trust his dad at all. So he felt like he believed his dad's stories for much too long, far longer than he should have done, and is now really questioning whether or not he is leading the right kind of life based on what his dad taught him, because he's about to have a child and doesn't know whether or not he should follow in the same way that his dad raised him and other things like that. They're the two primary characters that we meet. There are a lot of other sub-characters, like the guy, like Edward's wife, whom he meets and falls in love with at first sight, and then pursues for 3 years and thrusts himself upon. Yeah, those two are really the primary characters.
Okay, I see. And could you describe 2 of the key scenes from the film?
Okay, so one of the key scenes for me really was the point at which Edward finally meets his future wife, or finally professes his love to her. It stood out to me as a weird scene because he's been pursuing this woman for 3 years without knowing her. He just turns up at her door and says, "Hey, I know you, and I'm going to marry you." And she sort of is like, "Oh, I'm already engaged to someone." So instead of backing off, because he's a man of determination, he fills this this field with daffodils, which are supposedly her favourite plant, flower, whatever you'd call it. And then she falls apparently in love with him for the fact that he doesn't then beat up her then boyfriend, and he then suffers. So that stood out to me as a big scene. And the final scene as well is a big one, where this guy Edward Bloom, who is described or self-described as well as a big fish in a small pond. He's the big fish that remains that way because no one's ever found him out for whatever reason. So he's being carried in this dreamlike sequence towards a river where all of the people that he's met in his life are waving at him, and it seems like a huge, where everyone is happy and there's all kinds of things going on. Basically, he ends up being dropped into a river where this old man then turns into a fish and swims off. So those are 2 fairly important scenes. You know.
It seems like they stick out a bit.
Yeah.
Let's see. Could you describe the father and son relationship?
Yeah, the father and son relationship is one based entirely off of trust and distrust. The son really does not trust his dad at all. whereas the father seems to trust the son quite a lot more. It's a really odd one because this son is maybe in his like late 20s, early 30s, and he says he believed his father's tall tales up until he was in sort of his late teens or something like that. And it's then that I suppose their relationship begins to disintegrate. But so the son really does not trust his dad for the fact that he thinks he's been told these lies, and yet the father-son dynamic is sort of modified or completely unmodified by the fact that there's a mother figure as well in there who really doesn't do or say anything. So she's lived through some of the things and has heard stories and presumably met some of the people that this guy's father speaks about, and yet does nothing to try and change her son's impression of his father, which seems really, really sad. And the film ends on quite a happy note where the son decides, oh, actually, I can trust my father because he's not actually told me lies, and all of these characters and people that he's spoken about are real. When in reality, it probably ought to have been a much more despondent ending, because the son has realised that actually he's underestimated his father for his entire life and has really given him a massively hard time in his final dying days, where it's only on his father's deathbed that he really gives him any kind of relief and indulges him in a story of his own. So the father-son dynamic is a rather an odd one.
Sort of role reversal.
Yeah.
How would you interpret the ending?
Okay. Right, the ending was one I sort of sighed a bit at the end, like, okay, here we go. So the film is called Big Fish, and the reason it's called Big Fish is, as I say, the father is always describing himself as a big fish, and the reason he's a big fish is because the biggest fish is only that way because it's never caught. So the ending of the film is that, I suppose actually this is depends on the. I'm giving the fictitious ending. There's sort of the ending from the father's perspective and then the ending from everyone else's perspective.
Right.
I'll talk about the cemetery scene instead. Essentially, all of these characters come together and are at this father's funeral, and you've got the son and the daughter looking around, going, oh my god, there's a giant over there, oh, there's a small person over there, there are some Siamese twins, wow, okay, he's such a good person actually. But really it's an odd one, because there's someone who this guy's father is accused of having had an affair with, and then she just stood casually chatting around with the guy's wife and sharing a fun story. It's like, oh yeah, anecdotes about these people, and we're having a really great time. And then for me it was one that it was a happy ending that really ought to have been sad, because as I spoke about before, Will, this guy's son, was just a massive douche to him in the final days and was really not a good son, and all these other people around have been much more supportive when he now, because we have the agency of Will throughout the film, he sort of looks back on it and says, oh yeah, so that's the story of my father, and actually he was alright. So the ending's an odd one.
Okay. Did you enjoy the film?
In parts, yes, but on the whole, I don't think it was one that I would probably actively watch again. Just for the fact that there were some scenes that I know it being a Tim Burton film, there's quite a lot. The whole thing is fantastical and it's supposed to be that way, and in some ways we have to look at these things as as fantasy, because it's a mishmash of what we would see as like a true father-son kind of like a relatable father-son kind of narrative, but mixed in with these elements of weird and wonderful things. Yet I don't have an issue with the fantasy. I have an issue with the father-son relationship and the way that played out, in terms of, I thought that there were some disproportionate leaps in logic and disproportionate amounts or lack of trust. Amounts of trust or lack of trust between various characters. The thing is, the mother does nothing to help any kind of situation where she has all of the power to, and just lets it go by her.
And which scene was your favourite?
Which scene was my favourite? My favourite scene was probably there's a sequence where this guy, Edward Bloom, in his last few days is decided he's going to have a bath. He has a bath with all of his clothes on, and so the camera the sequence opens up showing him sort of looking down on him underneath the water, just with his eyes closed, and we presume that he's doing that of his own accord. And his wife walks in, and we see like the reverse shot from underneath the water, looking up at her, and she sort of smiles, and you get some ripple effects. And then he just sort of pops his head up, and then says, "I was drying out," and I was like, it was for me. It was like, okay, he's a fish, so he was drying out by not being in the water. So that sort of made me laugh in a sort of like kind of way. But that was a nice scene. Then his wife sort of decides she's going to hug him in the bath, and it's okay because he's a fish. And, it's a weird film.
Gotcha. Do you pay any attention to the way it was directed? Like, for example, the music or visual effects?
Yeah, I mean, well, there are a lot of visual effects. Being a Tim Burton film, it was ridden with them. There were times actually when I think there's a scene fairly early on where the lead character, or I suppose we can call him the young version of the father, is in this swamp thing, looking out at a fish who actually takes the form of a woman, and there were some really, I suppose by today's standards, they were quite obvious kind of light specks that were trying to be snow or sort of dust, but weren't quite up to it. I mean, at the time, yeah, fine, great, but there were a lot of things as well, like. I suppose it was quite obvious when. Well, I'm not looking for obvious things necessarily. Yes, there were lots of special effects, but they mixed in visual effects and practical effects to try and accomplish some of the more complex kind of ideas. But you know, it's Tim Burton. It is what it is. You're gonna get some kind of craziness through visual effects.
Right. How would you define the notion of reality in the film?
Well, I think the film would say there is no such thing as reality, because because the father and son both distort it so much, or distort their perceptions of reality, that you can't really, they can't purport that they can't claim that there is such a thing as real or not real, because to them anything and everything could be real, because if you say it enough times and people believe it, then who's to say whether it's not real? And then, you know, it being a film, we have to question whether reality is a thing really, because it's a